In our previous lesson, we emphasized that in Chinese style creation, we must be rigorous and meticulous. This is the only way to ensure our work appears professional. For example, with a rigorous approach, if a specific historical period is clearly defined, we must faithfully follow the corresponding historical context. What constitutes well-researched, what is problematic, and what are the details we often overlook? Let's look at a few cases. For instance, Tang Dynasty makeup, she has a red dot on her forehead. This is not commonly seen in later dynasties. But in this TV drama, they depicted it. That reflects meticulous research. Now, look at this Korean film. It depicts a war between the Qing dynasty and Korea. The Qing dynasty queue, braided hairstyle they portrayed differs from what is commonly recognized now. What we know is the queue that covers the entire back of the head. But in the early Qing dynasty, the lower part was shaved clean, with only a small braid on top. This, in fact, reflects a rigorous approach. Yet, no domestic films or TV dramas have done this. First, perhaps because the audience finds it unattractive. Second, maybe because actors feel it damages their image. Then there's the popular Qing Palace drama from last year. You might know about its effort to accurately recreate the standard of 3 earrings per ear. It might seem surprising at first glance, but after consulting historical records, you'll find it is indeed correct. Now, look at another drama by the same screenwriter. The background looks somewhat Japanese, because there's an identical structure in Japan. It was adapted from an existing historical site. But the drama's theme is the Han Dynasty. So this is not well researched. First, it's a Han Dynasty theme. Second, the Japanese torii, only one type, is somewhat similar to our Chinese memorial archway. The others are quite different. So, directly using this element in a Han Dynasty context is definitely inaccurate and problematic. Because even if ancient China had similar structures, their appearance would not be identical to the Japanese torii. And this image is almost exactly the same. Except for some minor differences at the top, the overall form follows the same design. This form corresponds to the Yobu torii type here. This type simply doesn't exist in China. At least, no textual or visual evidence currently proves its existence. Domestically, due to a long-held perception that Japanese elements all originated from China, so some people think we can also use them. This is not the case. There's a great deal of expertise behind it. Some elements cannot be used casually. When it comes to meticulousness, you must have a basic understanding of what you are depicting. And you should spend as much time as possible researching and refining your work. Otherwise, it could make the work a laughingstock. Let's look at another example. This is also a typical case of lack of meticulousness. It is originally a Tang Dynasty themed work, but the small flowers in the character's hair are almost the same as those worn by Japanese geishas. This does not mean that such flowers cannot be used at all. However, wearing flowers on the top of the head is definitely different from the geisha style. Because the geisha headdress developed gradually in Japan, much later than the Tang Dynasty. At the same time, during the Tang Dynasty, there was no such style. At least, this specific style certainly didn't exist. So this is equivalent to an anachronism in the work. Another example is the fan. This kind of folding fan did not exist in the Tang Dynasty. Moreover, it is universally recognized worldwide that this type of fan was invented by the Japanese. Because it was not until the Ming Dynasty in China that Koreans presented washan, Japanese folding fans, as tribute, that they became widely popular in China. During the Song Dynasty, the Japanese presented this kind of fan to the Song government. But the Song merely recorded it and did not popularize its use. Yet this TV drama is set in the Tang dynasty, hundreds of years earlier. So this is definitely incorrect. Moreover, the fan's style is completely characteristic of the Ming and Qing dynasties, whereas the round fan is a very typical Chinese fan. In early periods, the entire East Asian region used round fans, including the feather fan famously used by Zhuge Liang. The folding fan was invented after the Tang dynasty, based on at least 1,000 years of Chinese historical records. It was called washan, Japanese folding fans. So people might be unaccustomed to this, but within the context of centuries of history and culture, we know that scholars holding folding fans was very common. But in reality, this was definitely wrong for the Tang dynasty setting. As we mentioned earlier, rigor refers to rigor in terms of historical era, and meticulousness refers to the details we just discussed. If you work in industries like animation, film, or games, you must pay close attention to these detailed aspects. We often encounter projects with tight deadlines and limited time. This can lead to difficulties during the creation process. That's why we need to build a foundation through daily accumulation. Avoid cramming at the last minute. Next, let's discuss the principles of Chinese style creation. 2 key points to note. First, the visual elements must be believable. Visual elements refer to what things actually look like. The other point is having good aesthetics. This refers to the final presented effect of the element. In other words, how we arrange the lighting, apply filters, and make it more visually appealing. Let's start with the first point: believable visual elements. What does this mean? When creating Chinese style works, if we find ourselves unsure what to draw, it's often a problem with visual elements. We don't know what the thing actually looks like. So the correct workflow should be: we usually first understand what something looks like, then we create and design. This is creating based on understanding the visual elements. Thus, this once again reminds us that we should constantly accumulate knowledge. Otherwise, you might not even be able to start the creative process properly. Now, the second point: aesthetics. For example, we have a general impression of Tang dynasty films and TV dramas. But take a look at this image reconstructed based on historical research. The difference from what we see in TV dramas is quite significant. This is because, after studying these references or documents, they adapt them into a form acceptable to modern audiences. In other words, they took the audience's aesthetic preferences into account. However, some creators may ignore this and use the references directly. From a strictly accurate perspective, we find that from Emperor Gaozong to Emperor Wuzong to Emperor Shenzong, clothing styles actually underwent changes, becoming increasingly gorgeous and intricate. However, aesthetics have no specific standards. The reason visual elements need to be believable is that believable things are more rational, and people generally reach a consensus on them. But there is no universal consensus on aesthetics. Therefore, aesthetics are relatively subjective. Moreover, developing aesthetics takes time. So in daily life, we must expose ourselves to more recognized excellent works. In order to cultivate a good aesthetic taste, we should choose believable visual elements and maintain high aesthetic quality. As descendants of Chinese culture, we must set the highest standards and requirements for ourselves. Many people perceive the Song dynasty as having an elegant, minimalist aesthetic. But is this definitely the case in reality? This is a senior Chinese scholar currently researching at the Palace Museum. He has restored some decorative parts of Song dynasty architecture. They appear quite ornate, even more so than our perception of the Qing dynasty. You might wonder if this reconstruction is accurate. But the fact is that the Song dynasty is not exactly as we perceive it. And we can find a real-world parallel to this in Japan. We usually think of Japan as having a simple and elegant aesthetic style. But if we look at this Japanese temple, the polychrome paintings on it were actually painted by Koreans. When it comes to architectural polychrome paintings, the techniques used by Koreans have always been closer to those of the Song dynasty. The overall effect is quite ornate. But the overall color saturation isn't as exaggerated as in later periods. They applied 5 layers of color, resulting in this effect. Therefore, for anything related to history, we must research and investigate meticulously. We cannot rely on preconceived notions. We will find that sometimes there is a gap between imagination and historical reality. Relying solely on everyday accumulation is insufficient to bridge this gap. We must do rigorous research and be rigorous throughout the creative process. Only then will our works be recognized as professional.